During his father's funeral, a young man whispered to me, "Father, I killed him. It wasn't a heart attack." Bound by confession, I couldn't speak to anyone. But when the police investigation revealed the horrifying truth about what this beloved father had done, everything I thought I knew about good and evil was shattered. As Father Michael O'Connor, I had witnessed countless funerals in this sacred space, but something felt different about this particular Tuesday morning. Perhaps it was the unusual crowd that had gathered, nearly 200 souls filling every seat, or maybe it was the weight of grief that seemed heavier than usual. Robert Harrison lay in his mahogany casket at the altar, surrounded by wreaths of white lilies and red roses. At 62, he had been one of our most prominent parishioners, a successful businessman who had donated generously to our building fund and helped countless elderly members of our congregation with their real estate needs. His sudden death from a heart attack had shocked our small community of Haven Ridge. I adjusted my vestments and glanced at the packed church. Margaret Harrison sat in the front pew, dressed in black, her face pale but composed. Beside her, their three children, Daniel, the eldest at 28, 16-year-old Sarah, and 14-year-old Michael Jr., sat in somber silence. Daniel appeared particularly drawn, his usually bright eyes now hollow and distant. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," I began, reading from Psalm 23, as I had done countless times before. "He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters." My voice carried through the vaulted ceiling as I spoke about Robert's life, his dedication to family, his business success, his charitable works within our parish. I mentioned how he had helped Mrs. Thompson secure her finances when unscrupulous real estate agents had threatened her home, how he had assisted Mr. Evans with his property sale when medical bills mounted, how he had been a pillar of strength for so many in our community. As I delivered the eulogy, I watched the faces of the congregation. Tears flowed freely, heads nodded in agreement as I recounted Robert's good deeds. He had indeed been a man who seemed to embody Christian charity in action. Robert Harrison was a man who answered God's call to serve his neighbors, I continued. In Matthew 25, verse 40, Jesus tells us, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Robert lived these words. The service proceeded with the traditional readings and prayers. Mrs. Peterson, our church organist, played Amazing Grace beautifully. Several parishioners shared their memories of Robert's kindness and generosity. The atmosphere was one of deep respect and genuine sorrow for a life well lived. As we prepared for the final blessing and the procession to the cemetery, I noticed Daniel Harrison rising from his seat. Instead of joining the processional line, he approached me at the altar. His movement seemed unsteady, almost desperate. "Father O'Connor," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the organ music, "I need to speak with you, please." I nodded, assuming he wanted to arrange a private memorial service or discuss funeral arrangements. But as he leaned closer, his next words struck me like lightning from a clear sky. "Father, I killed him," Daniel whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "It wasn't a heart attack. I put something in his food that triggered it. When he fell and hit his head during our argument, I didn't call for help. I let him die." The blood drained from my face. My hands trembled as I held the prayer book. Around us, the congregation continued their solemn procession, unaware that the son of the deceased had just confessed to murder mere feet from his father's casket. I stared into Daniel's eyes and saw a torment that ran deeper than grief. This was a young man carrying a burden that was crushing his soul. His confession wasn't born of arrogance or indifference. It came from a place of profound anguish. "Daniel," I whispered back, struggling to maintain my composure, "we need to talk privately, after the burial service." He nodded frantically and rejoined the processional line, leaving me standing at the altar with a secret that changed everything. In 25 years of ministry, I had heard many confessions: adultery, theft, lies, and various sins of human weakness. But never murder, never this. As I followed the procession out of the church, my mind raced. The seal of confession is sacred in our faith. What Daniel had shared with me was bound by divine law and church doctrine. I could never repeat it to anyone, not to the police, not to the bishop, not even to save an innocent person's life. This principle had been hammered into me during seminary, and reinforced throughout my priesthood. But as we walked toward the cemetery, questions flooded my thoughts. Why would Daniel kill his own father? What could drive a young man to such a desperate act? And most troubling of all, if Robert Harrison wasn't the man I had just eulogized, who was he really? The burial service passed in a blur. I spoke the traditional words about dust returning to dust, about resurrection and eternal life, but my heart wasn't in them. I watched Daniel standing beside his mother, his face a mask of controlled agony. When Margaret Harrison threw the first handful of earth onto the casket, I saw her son flinch as if each clod was striking his own conscience. As the mourners began to disperse, offering final condolences to the family, I realized that my life as a priest had just taken a turn I never could have imagined. I was now the keeper of a secret that could destroy a family and shatter a community's faith in one of their most respected members. But more than that, I was a shepherd who had just learned that one of his flock might be a killer. The weight of pastoral responsibility pressed down on me like a stone. How do you counsel someone who has confessed to murder? How do you balance the sacred seal of confession with the demands of justice and truth? Standing in that cemetery, watching Robert Harrison's casket disappear beneath the earth, I knew that my greatest test as a priest was just beginning. The young man who had whispered his terrible secret to me was walking away with his family, carrying a burden that was eating him alive. And I was bound by sacred vows to carry that burden with him, no matter where it might lead us both. Part 2, deepening into the mystery. That evening I sat alone in my study at the parish house, the weight of Daniel's confession pressing against my chest like a physical burden. The late autumn wind rattled the windows as I stared at the crucifix on my wall, seeking guidance in Christ's suffering face. I had come to this calling 30 years ago, not through some dramatic revelation, but through a quiet certainty that had grown within me during my college years at Notre Dame. My Irish grandmother used to say that God whispers to those who listen with their hearts, and somewhere between philosophy classes and volunteering at the local soup kitchen, I heard that whisper clearly. After seminary at Mount St. Mary's, I had been assigned to St. Patrick's as a young associate pastor, eventually becoming the senior priest when Father Murphy retired. This community had shaped me as much as I had tried to shape it. Haven Ridge was a town of 8,000 souls, built around the old railroad depot and sustained by a mixture of farming, small manufacturing, and the kind of neighborly commerce that made America strong. St. Patrick's had been the spiritual anchor for Irish and German Catholic families since 1892, and over the decades we had weathered economic downturns, wars, and the changing face of modern America. The Harrison family had been pillars of our parish for 15 years, ever since Robert moved his growing construction business here from Chicago. I remember the day they first walked through our doors. Robert confident and successful, Margaret gracious and soft-spoken, and their young children bright-eyed and eager. Robert had immediately offered to help with our building maintenance, and Margaret had joined the Women's Auxiliary. What struck me most about Robert in those early days was his genuine concern for others, particularly the elderly members of our congregation. When Mrs. Patterson faced foreclosure after her husband's death, Robert had stepped in with financial advice and connections. When the old Schmidt place needed major repairs, Robert had organized volunteer work crews. Time and again, I had watched him extend helping hands to those who needed them most. Daniel had been just 13 when they arrived, a thoughtful boy who reminded me of myself at that age. Introspective, studious, carrying himself with a maturity beyond his years. I had been honored when Robert asked me to serve as Daniel's confirmation sponsor, and over the years I had watched him grow into a responsible young man who clearly loved his family deeply. That's what made this confession so bewildering. The Daniel I knew was incapable of violence, let alone patricide, yet the anguish in his eyes at the cemetery had been unmistakably real. This wasn't the fabrication of a disturbed mind. It was the tortured admission of a soul in crisis. As I reflected on our conversation, I remembered how Daniel had specifically requested to meet with me the following evening. "Father, I need guidance," he had whispered as we walked back from the cemetery. "I can't carry this alone anymore, but I don't know what's right." The sacred seal of confession is perhaps the most solemn responsibility we priests bear. In the Catechism, it's stated clearly, the sacramental seal is inviolable. Therefore, it is absolutely forbidden for a confessor to betray in any way, a penitent in words or in any manner, and for any reason. This principle had been tested throughout history. Priests had died rather than break this sacred trust. But Daniel's words kept echoing in my mind. I let him die. What circumstances could drive a son to watch his father perish? What darkness lay beneath the surface of what I had believed was a model Christian family? I opened my Bible to Proverbs 27 verse 6. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. Perhaps there were wounds in the Harrison household that I had failed to see, hidden beneath the veneer of respectability and success. My thoughts turned to Margaret Harrison. During Robert's funeral, I had noticed something that troubled me, a faint discoloration around her left wrist, barely visible beneath her black gloves. When she had embraced me after the service, I had felt her trembling in a way that seemed more than grief. And the children, Sarah and young Michael, had been unusually quiet, almost withdrawn, throughout the entire week of preparation for their father's funeral. I knelt before the altar in my private chapel, seeking divine guidance. Lord, I prayed, grant me wisdom to understand your will in this dark hour. Help me to be the shepherd you have called me to be, even when the path is unclear. As I prayed, memories surfaced of my conversations with Robert over the years. He had always been generous with his time and resources, but there had been moments when I glimpsed something harder beneath his charm. I recalled a parish council meeting where he had spoken sharply to Mrs. O'Brien about her late financial contributions, his voice carrying an edge that had surprised me. Another time, I had seen him lose his temper with a contractor working on the church roof, his face reddening with an anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Were these simply the normal stresses of a busy man, or had they been warnings I should have heeded? I thought about the families Robert had helped over the years. Mrs. Thompson, who had been so grateful for his assistance with her real estate troubles. The Evans family, who had praised his guidance during their time of financial difficulty. The elderly Wilsons, who had spoken so fondly of his help with their property matters before they passed away last spring. All of them had considered Robert a blessing, a guardian angel sent by God in their hour of need. Yet something nagged at me about these transactions. Why had so many of Robert's helped families eventually lost their homes or faced financial ruin despite his intervention? I had attributed it to the harsh realities of modern economics, but now I wondered if there might be another explanation. The next morning brought the familiar rhythms of parish life, but everything felt different through the lens of Daniel's confession. During morning mass, I struggled to focus on the Eucharistic prayer, my mind wandering to questions I couldn't voice. The small congregation of daily worshipers included several elderly parishioners whom Robert had assisted over the years, Mrs. Thompson among them. After Mass, she approached me with tears in her eyes. Father, I keep thinking about poor Robert, she said. He tried so hard to help me save my home when those terrible people were trying to steal it from me. Even though we couldn't stop them, I'll always be grateful for his kindness. Her words struck me strangely. I had heard the story before, but now I listened with different ears. Mrs. Thompson, I asked gently, can you tell me more about what happened with your house? She explained how Robert had warned her about real estate scammers who were targeting elderly homeowners, how he had connected her with buyers who could purchase her property quickly to protect it from the fraudsters. The money was supposed to be held safely while legal battles were fought, but somehow the buyers had disappeared and her savings had vanished with them. Robert was devastated that his plan didn't work, she continued. He felt so responsible, but I told him it wasn't his fault. At least he tried to help when no one else would. As she spoke, a chill ran down my spine. What if Robert hadn't been the victim of these schemes? What if he had been their architect? That evening, as I prepared for my meeting with Daniel, I found myself caught between my pastoral duty to comfort the grieving and a growing suspicion that the man we had buried might not have been the saint we believed him to be. The young man who would soon enter my study carrying the weight of patricide might in fact be carrying something else entirely, the burden of having stopped a predator who had been hiding in plain sight among God's flock. But until I heard his full confession, until I understood the complete truth, I could only pray for wisdom and prepare my heart for whatever darkness was about to be revealed. Part 3. Expanding the conflict. Daniel arrived at my study precisely at 7 o'clock that Thursday evening, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor of the parish house. The young man who entered looked like he had aged years in the 3 days since his father's funeral. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance had given way to wrinkled clothes and unkempt hair. "Father O'Connor," he began, then stopped, his voice catching in his throat. "Sit down, son," I said gently, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Take your time. The Lord knows the burdens we carry, even when we struggle to voice them." What Daniel told me over the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about the Harrison family and the man we had just laid to rest. His confession was not the straightforward admission of guilt I had expected, but rather the unraveling of a tapestry of fear, manipulation, and desperate protection that had been woven over years. Robert Harrison, Daniel revealed, had been living a double life. The man who smiled warmly during Sunday services and wrote generous checks for our building fund had terrorized his own family behind closed doors. Daniel spoke of countless nights when he and his siblings had huddled in Sarah's room, listening to their mother's muffled cries and their father's angry shouting. He described injuries that Margaret had explained away as household accidents: a broken wrist from falling downstairs, ribs from, quote, slipping in the shower. "He threatened to destroy us if we ever told anyone," Daniel whispered, his hands trembling as he spoke. "He said he had friends in the police department, connections who would make sure we lost everything if Mom ever tried to leave." But it was the second part of Daniel's confession that truly shook me to my core. He had discovered that his father's, quote, charitable work with elderly parishioners was actually an elaborate fraud scheme. Robert would approach vulnerable seniors with warnings about real estate scams, then orchestrate fake sales to shell companies he controlled. The victims would hand over their life savings, believing they were protecting their homes, only to find themselves penniless when the supposed buyers vanished. "I found the documents in his office," Daniel said, his voice barely audible. "Files on every family he had, quote, helped. Mrs. Evans, the Wilsons, Mrs. Thompson, all of them. He stole everything they had, Father, and when some of them started asking questions..." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The implication hung in the air between us like a dark cloud. The Sunday service that followed was perhaps the most difficult of my priesthood. As I stood before the congregation delivering my homily on the parable of the Good Samaritan, I found myself looking at faces with new eyes. Mrs. Thompson sat in her usual pew, 5 rows back on the left, wearing the same faded dress she had worn for months. I had attributed her simple attire to elderly frugality, but now I wondered if it was born of financial desperation. In the back of the church, I noticed Mrs. Evans' daughter, Carol, who had driven down from Minneapolis for her father's funeral just 2 months earlier. She appeared tired and stressed, and I remembered her mentioning something about having to help her mother with unexpected financial difficulties after her father's passing. During the sign of peace, I watched Margaret Harrison embrace Mrs. Thompson, and I caught a glimpse of fresh bruising on Margaret's forearm. My heart ached as I realized that even in death, Robert's legacy of pain continued to cast shadows over those he had claimed to love. After the service, I made a point of speaking with several families that Robert had, quote, assisted over the years. Each conversation added another piece to the horrifying puzzle Daniel had begun to reveal. Mrs. Patterson mentioned how grateful she remained for Robert's help, even though she had ultimately lost her home anyway. The Schmidt family had similar stories. Robert's well-intentioned efforts had somehow resulted in the loss of their family farm. "He tried so hard to help us fight those awful people," Mrs. Patterson told me, tears in her eyes. "It wasn't his fault that those buyers turned out to be criminals too. Robert was heartbroken when we lost everything." As she spoke, I felt physically ill. These trusting souls had no idea that their guardian angel had been the architect of their ruin. They continued to speak of Robert with gratitude and affection, making his betrayal even more monstrous. That evening, I knelt in the empty church, surrounded by the flickering light of votive candles, wrestling with questions that seemed to have no good answers. The book of Job came to mind, the righteous man tested by unimaginable suffering, crying out to God for understanding. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him," Job had declared. But what about when the slaying was done by human hands, wearing the mask of righteousness? I thought about the seal of confession, that sacred trust that bound me to silence. Daniel had not technically made his confession in the sacramental sense. Our conversation had been pastoral counseling rather than formal confession. Yet I felt bound by the same principles of confidentiality. How could I betray the trust of a young man who had risked everything to protect innocent people? But silence felt like complicity. Every day that passed was another day that Robert's victims lived in financial ruin, unaware that their suffering had been orchestrated by someone they trusted. Every night was another night that Margaret and the children lived with the trauma of years of abuse, unable to fully heal because the truth remained buried with their tormentor. I began incorporating subtle themes into my daily homilies. Reflections on courage in the face of evil, the importance of speaking truth even when it was difficult, the biblical mandate to protect the vulnerable. I hope that somehow these messages might reach those who needed to hear them, might give someone the strength to come forward with information that could help heal our wounded community. Wednesday brought an unexpected visitor to my office. Sarah Harrison, just 16 but carrying herself with a maturity that broke my heart, knocked hesitantly on my door during my office hours. "Father O'Connor, I was wondering if I could talk to you about my dad," she said, her voice small and uncertain. As Sarah spoke, I learned that the children had lived in constant fear of their father's unpredictable rages. They had developed elaborate systems of communication, hand signals to warn each other when Robert was in a dangerous mood, hiding places throughout the house where they could escape his anger, code words they could use around neighbors to call for help without seeming to ask for it. "Daniel always tried to protect us," she whispered. "When Dad would get really bad, Daniel would step in and take the punishment instead. He saved us so many times, Father. I don't know what we would have done without him." Her words painted a picture of a young man who had been forced to become a protector long before he should have had to bear such responsibility. The Daniel who had whispered his confession to me at his father's funeral wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a brother who had finally found a way to ensure his family's safety. That night, I found myself face to face with the most challenging moral dilemma of my priesthood. I held in my hands the key to bringing justice to countless victims and peace to a traumatized family. Yet I was bound by sacred vows that seemed to demand my silence. I opened my Bible to Matthew 18, verse 6. "If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." Robert Harrison had caused many little ones to stumble. The question that haunted me was whether my continued silence would make me complicit in that same sin. As I extinguished the candles in my study that night, I prayed for wisdom I didn't possess and strength I wasn't sure I had. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new faces in need of pastoral care, new opportunities to serve God's people. But it would also bring me one day closer to a decision that would define not just my priesthood, but my very soul. Part 4. Moral Dilemma and Escalation. The crisis came on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Robert Harrison's funeral. Mrs. Agnes Evans, 78 years old, and one of our most faithful parishioners, collapsed during the 8 o'clock Mass. As I administered the last rites in the ambulance, her frail hand gripped mine with desperate strength. "Father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the siren's wail, "I need to tell someone the truth about Robert Harrison before it's too late." My blood ran cold. Here was another piece of the puzzle, arriving at the moment when I thought I couldn't bear any more secrets. At Haven Ridge General Hospital, as doctors worked to stabilize Mrs. Evans, her daughter Carol pulled me aside in the sterile waiting room. "Father O'Connor, my mother has been having episodes of confusion lately," Carol explained, her face etched with worry. "She keeps saying she needs to tell someone about Robert Harrison, about some mistakes she made. The doctors think she might be developing dementia, but these episodes started right after his funeral. She becomes agitated whenever anyone mentions his name." I felt the walls closing in around me, another victim of Robert's schemes, carrying guilt and confusion that was literally making her sick. How many more were suffering in silence, believing themselves complicit in their own destruction? That afternoon, I made the difficult decision to call Bishop McCarthy in the diocesan office. Without violating Daniel's confidence, I needed guidance on how to handle pastoral knowledge of serious wrongdoing. The bishop, a wise man who had shepherded priests through countless moral crises, listened carefully to my carefully worded questions. "Michael," he said, using my first name as he had when I was a young priest seeking his counsel. "The seal of confession is absolute, but our duty to prevent ongoing harm to our flock is equally sacred. Sometimes the greatest act of love requires the greatest personal sacrifice." His words offered little comfort, but confirmed what my conscience had been telling me. I was standing at the crossroads between two sacred duties, and any path I chose would exact a terrible price. The following Sunday, I preached from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, where Jesus condemns those who devour widows' houses while making a show of lengthy prayers. My voice carried across the sanctuary with an intensity that surprised even me. "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites!" I read, my eyes finding the faces of Robert's victims scattered throughout the congregation. "You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are." I saw Mrs. Thompson shift uncomfortably in her pew. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Several parishioners exchanged puzzled glances, perhaps wondering why their priest seemed so agitated on what should have been a peaceful Sunday morning. After the service, Daniel approached me with dark circles under his eyes that had grown more pronounced each day. The young man was clearly suffering under the weight of his secret, and I feared for his mental and spiritual health. "Father, I can't sleep," he confessed. "Every night I see his face, hear his voice threatening us. I keep thinking about all the people he hurt, all the families he destroyed. Sometimes I wonder if I should turn myself in, just to make it stop." "Daniel," I said carefully, "have you considered that there might be other ways to help those families? Ways that don't require destroying your own life?" He looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "What kind of ways, Father?" I wanted to tell him about anonymous tips to the police, about ways to expose the truth without implicating himself, but the words died in my throat. I was walking a tightrope between pastoral care and conspiracy, and every step felt like it might send us both tumbling into an abyss. That week brought another crushing blow. Mrs. Evans passed away in her sleep, taking her secrets with her to the grave. At her funeral, I watched her daughter Carol struggle with the financial burden of medical bills that had consumed her mother's remaining savings. The irony was bitter. Mrs. Evans had died poor because Robert Harrison had stolen her security, and now she was gone before anyone could learn the full truth of what he had done to her. The night after Mrs. Evans' funeral, I found myself alone in the church at 3 a.m, prostrate before the altar in a state of spiritual anguish I had never experienced. The weight of accumulated secrets, the faces of the suffering, the impossible choice between sacred duties, all of it pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. "Lord, what would you have me do?" I cried out in the darkness. "How can I serve justice while honoring the vows I've taken? How can I protect the innocent without betraying the trust placed in me?" The silence that answered me felt heavy with divine presence, but also with the burden of human choice. God had given me free will, and now I had to use it in circumstances that seemed to offer no righteous path forward. I thought of Moses, who had killed an Egyptian taskmaster to protect his fellow Hebrews. I thought of David, who had faced down Goliath when all the trained warriors cowered in fear. I thought of Jesus himself, who had overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple, choosing righteous anger over peaceful compliance. Sometimes I realized love demands action that appears to violate lesser laws in service of higher justice. The next morning brought news that shattered my last hope for a peaceful resolution. Margaret Harrison arrived at my office, her left eye swollen shut and her lip split. She had waited until her children were at school before coming to see me, not wanting them to witness her shame. "Father," she said, her voice thick with pain, "people are starting to ask questions about Robert's business dealings. Someone came to the house yesterday asking about properties he had handled. When I told them I didn't know anything, they got angry. They said Robert owed them money, and now they expect me to pay." My heart sank. Robert's criminal activities were catching up with his family, and Margaret was being victimized all over again. The children who had suffered years of abuse at their father's hands were now facing threats from his criminal associates. "Margaret," I said gently, "there are people who can help you. Legal protections, financial assistance programs. You don't have to face this alone." She shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her bruised face. "You don't understand, Father. Robert made sure we could never escape. He has files on everyone, police officers, judges, businessmen. He said if we ever tried to leave or expose him, his friends would make sure we lost everything. They'd take the children away from me. I can't risk that." As Margaret left my office, I realized that Robert Harrison's web of corruption and intimidation extended far beyond what Daniel had revealed. This wasn't just about financial fraud. It was about a network of complicit officials who had enabled his crimes and who might still be protecting his interests even after his death. That evening, as I prepared for what I knew would be another sleepless night, I made a decision that would change everything. I could no longer remain a passive keeper of secrets while innocent people suffered. The time had come to choose between the letter of canon law and the spirit of Christian love. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized years ago but had never hoped to use. It was time to call in favors from my seminary days, to reach out to people who moved in circles far removed from parish life, but who shared my commitment to justice. The conversation that followed would set in motion events that none of us could control, but at least they would be events guided by the light of truth rather than the darkness of secrets. As I hung up the phone, I whispered a prayer for forgiveness, both for what I had done and for what I was about to do. The path ahead was uncertain, but I could no longer stand idly by while evil triumphed in the name of procedural righteousness. Sometimes, I had learned, being a good priest meant being willing to risk everything, even your priesthood itself. Part 5. Critical point. The phone call that changed everything came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Haven Ridge Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit was calling from the hospital, where she had been summoned for what initially appeared to be a routine case of elderly fraud. "Father O'Connor, I'm sorry to wake you," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We have a situation at the hospital." And "Father O'Connor," Mrs. Mills said, reaching for my hand, "I need to confess something before I die. I can't meet my maker carrying this guilt." What she told us over the next hour shattered any remaining illusions about Robert Harrison's schemes. Mrs. Mills revealed that she had been threatened by men claiming to represent Robert's business partners. Men who said she owed them money because Robert had used her property as collateral for illegal transactions. When she protested that she had never authorized such arrangements, they had produced documents bearing what appeared to be her signature. They said if I didn't pay what Robert owed them, they would take my house and make sure something happened to my granddaughter, she whispered. "Emily is only 6 years old, Father. She stays with me every weekend. I couldn't risk her safety." Detective Rodriguez and I exchanged glances. The scope of Robert's criminal network was becoming clearer and more dangerous. But what Mrs. Mills said next sent ice through my veins. "There's another woman, Father, Mrs. Janet Murphy from St. Mary's Parish in Millbrook. They showed me her picture. She's pregnant with her third child and they said she's next. They said Robert had promised them her property before he died, and now they need to collect." I knew Janet Murphy. She was a young mother whose husband had died in a car accident 6 months ago, leaving her with 2 small children and a mountain of medical debt. If Robert's criminal associates were targeting her, she was walking into the same trap that had destroyed so many others. "Mrs. Mills," Detective Rodriguez said gently, "we need you to tell us everything you know about these men. Names, descriptions, anything that might help us protect Mrs. Murphy and stop them from hurting other people." As Mrs. Mills provided details to the detective, I stepped into the hallway, my mind racing. The criminal network that Robert had built was still active, still targeting innocent families. My continued silence wasn't just protecting Daniel anymore. It was enabling ongoing crimes against vulnerable people. The next morning brought a flood of revelations that seemed orchestrated by divine providence itself. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the county medical examiner, called with questions about several deaths she had been reviewing as part of a routine audit. The pattern she had discovered was deeply troubling. "Father O'Connor," she said when I met her at her office, "I've been looking at the deaths of 4 elderly individuals over the past 2 years, all parishioners of St. Patrick's, all patients who died within weeks of major financial transactions. While their deaths were ruled natural at the time, the timing is suspicious enough that I want to order additional tests." She showed me the files. Mr. Evans, Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Johnson, and now Mrs. Evans. All had died shortly after Robert Harrison had, quote, helped them with real estate matters. All had been found with elevated levels of various medications in their systems, levels that could be explained by normal medical treatment, but could also indicate deliberate poisoning. "I can't prove anything yet," Dr. Walsh continued, "but if these deaths were not natural, we're looking at a serial killer who used his position in the community to target vulnerable victims." That afternoon, I received an unexpected visit from Daniel. He looked worse than I had ever seen him, gaunt, hollow-eyed, and shaking with nervous exhaustion. He collapsed into the chair across from my desk and buried his face in his hands. "Father, I can't do this anymore," he sobbed. "I thought killing him would end it, but it's getting worse. These men came to our house again last night. They threatened my mother, said terrible things about what they would do to Sarah if we didn't cooperate with their demands." "What demands, Daniel?" "They want me to help them access my father's files, his client lists, his bank accounts. They say I'm his heir, so I'm responsible for his debts. But Father, if I give them that information, they'll hurt more people. They'll do to other families what he did to us." I sat in silence, watching this young man wrestle with an impossible choice. He had killed his father to protect his family and stop the crimes. But Robert's death had only handed control of the operation to even more dangerous people. "Daniel," I said carefully, "what if there was another way? What if the authorities could stop these men without you having to sacrifice yourself?" He looked up at me with desperate hope. "How, Father? How could that happen?" That night, I spent hours in prayer before the altar of St. Patrick's, wrestling with the most difficult decision of my priestly life. The words of Jesus echoed in my mind. "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." But what if the life I needed to lay down was my own reputation, my standing in the church, perhaps even my priesthood itself? I thought of King Solomon, faced with 2 women claiming the same child. His wisdom had revealed the truth by proposing to cut the child in half. The real mother would rather give up her claim than see the child harmed. Perhaps it was time for me to threaten to cut in half the sacred seal of confession in order to protect the innocent. At dawn, I made 3 phone calls that would set everything in motion. The first was to Detective Rodriguez, providing her with enough anonymous information to begin investigating Robert's criminal network without revealing Daniel's confession. The second was to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, sharing details about interstate fraud schemes that crossed jurisdictional lines. The third call was the most difficult. I contacted Janet Murphy directly, using a carefully crafted story about disturbing rumors I had heard regarding threats against families with recent real estate transactions. I urged her to contact the police immediately if anyone approached her with unusual financial proposals or if she felt unsafe in any way. By noon, news was spreading through Haven Ridge that federal agents had raided Robert Harrison's business office and were executing search warrants on several properties throughout the county. The investigation that I had helped trigger with my anonymous tips was moving faster than I had dared hope. That evening, as I watched the news coverage of the arrests, Daniel appeared at my door one final time. His face was different now, still marked by grief and guilt, but no longer carrying the crushing weight of absolute despair. "Father," he said, "I need to make my confession, a real confession this time. I need to tell you everything, officially, so that you can guide me toward the right path." I led him to the confessional, that sacred space where human sin meets divine mercy. As Daniel knelt and began the formal words of confession, I realized that my own spiritual crisis had reached its resolution. Sometimes protecting the innocent required risking everything, even the very vows that defined your life. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Daniel began, and I prepared to hear once again the terrible truth that would either damn us both or set us free. The moment of ultimate choice had arrived, and I was ready to embrace whatever consequences God's justice demanded. Part 6, Revelation and Confrontation. The dam broke on a gray October morning when FBI agent Sarah Chen stood before a packed courtroom and read aloud from Robert Harrison's seized files. The documents painted a picture of systematic fraud that had operated for nearly 8 years, victimizing dozens of elderly residents across 3 counties. The defendant, through his company, Harrison Real Estate Solutions, orchestrated a sophisticated scheme targeting vulnerable senior citizens, Agent Chen testified. He would approach victims claiming to protect them from real estate scams, then facilitate fraudulent sales to shell companies he controlled. When victims became suspicious or threatened to expose the scheme, evidence suggests that Harrison would escalate to more extreme measures. I sat in the back of the courtroom, having been called as a character witness for the community impact. What Agent Chen revealed next sent shockwaves through the packed gallery. Financial records show that Robert Harrison systematically transferred over $2.3 million from victim accounts to offshore holdings. Additionally, we have evidence linking him to the suspicious deaths of at least 4 elderly victims who had begun questioning his methods. The gasps that rippled through the courtroom were audible. Mrs. Thompson, sitting 3 rows ahead of me, dropped her purse to the floor. Carol Evans, who had driven down from Minneapolis, covered her mouth in horror. For months, these families had mourned Robert Harrison as a good man who had tried unsuccessfully to help them. Now they were learning that he had been the architect of their suffering. The formal charges were read: fraud, embezzlement, elder abuse, and 4 counts of suspected homicide. The investigation had moved with stunning speed once federal authorities became involved, and the evidence they had uncovered painted Robert Harrison not as a pillar of the community, but as a predator who had used his respected position to hunt the most vulnerable members of our congregation. That afternoon, the media descended on Haven Ridge like locusts. News vans lined Main Street, and reporters cornered anyone willing to discuss the Angel of Death case. As they had begun calling it, the peaceful rhythm of our small town was shattered by the attention, and many residents found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about their neighbors and community leaders. I spent that day making visits to the families most affected by the revelations. Mrs. Thompson was inconsolable, racked with guilt over having praised Robert's kindness, even after losing her home. "How could I have been so blind, Father?" she asked through her tears. "I defended him to everyone who asked questions. I told them he was a saint." "You weren't blind," I assured her. "You were trusting, which is what good people do. Robert Harrison exploited that trust, but the fault lies with him, not with you." Carol Evans was struggling with a different kind of pain. "My father died believing that Robert had tried to help him," she said. "Now I find out that Robert may have killed him. How do I live with that knowledge? How do I honor my father's memory when everything we believed was a lie?" Each conversation was a delicate balance of pastoral care and truth-telling. These families needed to process their grief and anger, while also beginning to understand that they were victims, not accomplices in Robert's crimes. The most difficult visit was to the Harrison home itself. Margaret Harrison had become a virtual prisoner in her own house, unable to leave without facing reporters and curious neighbors. When I arrived, I found her sitting in her kitchen, staring at family photographs with hollow eyes. 22 years, she whispered. 22 years I lived with that monster, and I thought it was normal. I thought all marriages involved fear and pain and walking on eggshells. The children grew up thinking that was how fathers were supposed to behave. Sarah and young Michael were staying with their aunt in the next county, trying to process the revelation that their father had been both an abuser and a killer. Daniel was the only one still at home, and the weight of his secret knowledge was evident in every line of his face. "Father," Margaret continued, "the FBI agents asked me about Robert's business dealings, about whether I knew any details. I told them I was kept completely in the dark about his work, but now I keep wondering, should I have known? Were there signs I missed? Could I have stopped him if I had been braver?" "Margaret," I said firmly, "you were a victim of domestic violence. Abusers isolate their victims precisely to prevent them from seeing the full picture. You survived an impossible situation while protecting your children. That required enormous courage." The following Sunday, I faced the most challenging sermon of my priesthood. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the vestibule. Some had come seeking spiritual guidance. Others were drawn by morbid curiosity about the murder church, as some tabloid had dubbed us. I chose my text from Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. My dear brothers and sisters, I began. This week our community has been shaken to its foundation. We have learned that someone we trusted, someone we respected, was living a double life that brought tremendous pain to innocent people. We are angry, we are confused, and we are questioning how such evil could hide among us for so long. I looked out at the faces before me, some filled with anger, others with sorrow, many simply numb with shock. But I want to remind you of something important. The evil that Robert Harrison committed does not diminish the genuine love and support that this community has shown to one another. The meals you brought to sick neighbors, the comfort you offered to the grieving, the generosity you showed to those in need, none of that was tainted by one man's sins. As I spoke, I saw some of the tension begin to leave people's faces. Mrs. Thompson nodded slightly. Carol Evans wiped away a tear. In the front pew, Margaret Harrison sat with her shoulders a little straighter than they had been in weeks. We cannot undo the harm that has been done, I continued, but we can choose how we respond to it. We can choose to let it divide us, or we can choose to let it strengthen our commitment to protecting and caring for one another. We can choose to let suspicion poison our relationships, or we can choose to build better systems for identifying and helping those who are vulnerable. After the service, something remarkable happened. Instead of rushing away from the difficult emotions of the day, people began talking to one another. Mrs. Thompson approached Carol Evans, and they embraced and shared grief and understanding. Other victims of Robert's schemes found each other and began comparing experiences, realizing they were not alone. In the weeks that followed, our parish became a center for healing in ways I had never imagined. We established support groups for elder fraud victims and their families. We created financial literacy programs to help seniors recognize and avoid scams. Most importantly, we fostered an environment where people felt safe to ask for help when they felt threatened or confused. Daniel made the decision to work with prosecutors, providing information about his father's crimes while accepting responsibility for his own actions. The district attorney, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances and Daniel's cooperation, offered a plea agreement that acknowledged both the crimes he had committed and the desperate situation that had driven him to them. "Father," Daniel said during one of our counseling sessions, "I know I'll have to face consequences for what I did, but for the first time in years, I can sleep at night knowing that he can't hurt anyone anymore." The healing process was neither quick nor simple. Some families struggled to forgive themselves for having trusted Robert. Others grappled with complex feelings about Daniel, who was simultaneously a killer and a protector. But gradually, through shared grief and mutual support, our community began to emerge stronger from the crisis. The final arrest came 2 months later when federal agents apprehended 3 men connected to Robert's criminal network. The investigation had expanded to uncover a multi-state operation that had victimized hundreds of elderly Americans. Justice was finally being served, not just for Robert's direct victims, but for countless others who had suffered in silence. As I prepared for the final chapter of this terrible story, I reflected on the mysterious ways that truth emerges even from the darkest circumstances. Daniel's confession, made in anguish and desperation, had ultimately led to justice for many more people than he could have imagined. Sometimes, I realized, God works through our brokenness to accomplish his purposes in ways we cannot foresee. Part 7. Redemption and Wisdom. 1 year later, on a crisp Sunday morning in October, I stood before the altar of St. Patrick's Church, preparing for what would become one of the most meaningful services of my priesthood. The sanctuary was filled with familiar faces, but the atmosphere was different now. Warmer, more genuine, marked by the deep bonds that can only be forged through shared struggle and mutual healing. Daniel Harrison sat in the third pew with his mother and siblings, no longer carrying the haunted expression that had marked him for so many months. 3 weeks earlier, a judge had sentenced him to 5 years of probation and 2,000 hours of community service, recognizing both the gravity of his actions and the extraordinary circumstances that had driven them. The courtroom had been packed with character witnesses, many of them the very people his father had victimized, who spoke of Daniel's courage in exposing the truth and his dedication to helping other families recover from similar crimes. "Your Honor," Mrs. Thompson had said during the sentencing hearing, her voice strong despite her 78 years. "This young man saved my life, not just by stopping his father, but by giving me the truth I needed to understand that I wasn't a fool for trusting someone I thought was good. He gave me back my dignity." The community service Daniel was performing had become a calling rather than a punishment. He had used his computer skills to help elderly residents protect themselves from internet scams, worked with law enforcement to track down other fraud victims, and volunteered countless hours with our parish's new elder protection ministry. In the front pew, Margaret Harrison looked like a different woman than the broken, frightened person I had counseled a year ago. Therapy, the support of our congregation, and the freedom from fear had allowed her natural strength to emerge. She had become a powerful advocate for domestic violence prevention, speaking at churches and community centers about the warning signs that others might miss. "I spent 22 years believing that love meant accepting abuse," she had told a women's group the previous month. "Now I know that real love, God's love, never demands that we diminish ourselves or accept harm. The greatest gift I can give my children is showing them what healthy relationships look like." Young Sarah and Michael Harrison had blossomed in ways that brought tears to my eyes. Sarah, now 17, had started a peer counseling program at her high school for students dealing with family trauma. Michael, 15, had channeled his pain into art, creating powerful paintings that depicted the journey from darkness to light. Both children had learned that family was defined not by blood or fear, but by love, support, and mutual respect. The victims of Robert's schemes had found their own paths to healing. Through the restitution fund established by the federal prosecution, most families had recovered significant portions of their stolen assets. More importantly, they had found each other, creating a support network that extended far beyond our parish boundaries. Mrs. Thompson had moved into a senior living community where she served as a volunteer advocate for residents' rights. Carol Evans had established a foundation in her father's memory to help families navigate elder care fraud. The wisdom they had gained through suffering was now being used to protect others from similar harm. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had occurred within our parish itself. The crisis had stripped away the comfortable assumptions that had allowed evil to hide among us, forcing us to build something stronger and more authentic in its place. We had implemented new financial oversight procedures, created support groups for various forms of trauma, and most importantly, fostered a culture where people felt safe to seek help when they felt threatened or confused. "Beloved," I began my sermon that morning, looking out at faces that reflected both sorrow and hope. Today marks the one-year anniversary of events that shook our community to its foundation. We have walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and by God's grace, we have emerged not unscathed but undefeated. I paused, letting my gaze rest on each family that had been directly affected by Robert's crimes. In the book of Romans, Paul tells us that we can rejoice in our sufferings, because suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. This morning, I see that hope reflected in each of your faces. Not the naive hope that pretends evil doesn't exist, but the mature hope that knows God can bring good even from the darkest circumstances. During the offering that morning, something extraordinary happened. Daniel Harrison stood and walked to the front of the church, carrying an envelope in his trembling hands. With quiet dignity, he placed it in the collection basket, then returned to his seat. Later, I would discover that it contained his first paycheck from a new job at a nonprofit organization fighting financial crimes against seniors, money he had chosen to donate to our parish's Victim Assistance Fund. After the service, our congregation gathered in the parish hall for what had become a monthly tradition, a shared meal where victims, their families, and supporters came together, not as separate groups nursing private wounds, but as a unified community committed to mutual care. The conversations that flowed around those tables were a testament to the transformative power of truth spoken in love. Mrs. Thompson sat with Margaret Harrison, sharing recipes and grandmothering advice. Carol Evans discussed college plans with Sarah Harrison, offering to help with scholarship applications. Daniel worked quietly in the kitchen, serving food to the same people his father had victimized, finding peace in acts of service that honored their dignity rather than exploiting their vulnerability. During dessert, Margaret Harrison stood to address the gathering. Her voice was steady and strong as she spoke. "A year ago, I thought my family story was ending," she said. "We had lost everything, our safety, our trust, our faith in the future. But this community showed us that endings can also be beginnings. You didn't just forgive us for what Robert did. You helped us forgive ourselves and find a way forward." She looked directly at Mrs. Thompson, tears glistening in her eyes. "You could have hated us. You could have demanded revenge. Instead, you showed us mercy. You taught us that love is stronger than hate, that healing is possible even after terrible wounds, and that families can be built on something more lasting than blood or fear." As the afternoon drew to a close, I found myself standing in the church sanctuary, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The young man who had whispered his terrible confession to me at his father's funeral had been transformed by the power of truth and redemption. The victims who had suffered in silence had found their voices and their strength. The community that had been deceived and divided had discovered deeper wells of compassion and wisdom. I thought about the seal of confession and the moral crisis that had nearly destroyed my faith in my calling. What I had learned was that sometimes the greatest act of pastoral love requires the willingness to risk everything, even our most sacred vows, to protect the innocent. God's law is ultimately about love, and love sometimes demands that we choose the spirit over the letter, mercy over mere rule-following. The setting sun painted the stained glass windows in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, casting rainbow patterns across the altar where I had struggled with impossible choices. In that sacred light, I offered a prayer of gratitude for the painful gift of wisdom, for the privilege of shepherding people through their darkest hours toward the light of hope. As I prepared to lock the church that evening, Daniel Harrison appeared at my side. The young man who had once carried the weight of patricide now stood straight and peaceful, his eyes clear with purpose. "Father," he said simply, "thank you for helping me find my way home." I embraced him, this child of my congregation who had been forced to make adult choices in impossible circumstances, who had paid a terrible price for protecting the innocent, and who had found redemption through truth, service, and the transformative power of Christian love. "Daniel," I replied, "you were never lost. You were always walking toward the light, even when the path seemed darkest. God knew your heart, and He has honored your sacrifice by bringing healing to many." As we walked together toward the parish house, I reflected on the mystery of divine providence working through human brokenness. Evil had hidden among us for years, but its exposure had ultimately led to greater protection for the vulnerable, deeper bonds within our community, and a more authentic expression of Christian love. The story that had begun with a whispered confession of murder had become a testament to the power of truth, the possibility of redemption, and the triumph of love over fear. In the end, light had overcome darkness, not through the absence of suffering, but through the transformation of suffering into wisdom, compassion, and hope. And in that transformation, I had glimpsed the face of God Himself.